So hi everybody, we are into the third and last session of our conference, and thank you for being with us. The speakers are now the captive audiences because the students are almost gone, but for those who joined us, thank you. So as I said, the rationale of the conference or the symposium is looking at three circles. One was the Israeli-Palestinian Jordanian one. The second is the, I'm wondering whether I can use the Mesopotamian one, using an ancient historic name, but the Tigris and Euphrates relating to Turkey, Syria and Iraq. And then the third one would be the Nile Basin. So the chair of the last session is Professor Dr. Aysegül Kibaroglu, I hope I pronounce it correctly, I've been practicing on that, who is not only the chair of this session, but also a co-sponsor of our conference through MEF University in Turkey. She is the chair of the Department of Political Science and International Relations at MEF University in Istanbul. She was a visiting professor at the University of Texas in Austin. Previously, she was a faculty member and vice chair of the Department of International Relations at the Middle East Technical University in Ankara. METU, is this METU? Okay, I still remember. And she's the author of numerous articles and book, really producing immensely so. I got to know her through the fact that she's included in the reading of the class that Aaron Packman and I conduct, and her most recent publications were a edited volume, I believe, Building a Regime for Waters in the Euphrates-Tigris River Basin, published by Brill in 2002, and Sustainability and Engineered Rivers in Arid Lands, published by Cambridge in 2021. So thank you, Aysegül, for the cooperation, and the session is all yours.
Thank you very much, Elie. Thank you very much for the warm welcome to all Northwestern people. It was really a privilege to collaborate on this symposium. I wouldn't like to take your time. We feel like afternoon. We are still in the late morning, but we have limited time. We have two major basins to talk about, and one project like Red Sea or another basin like Red Sea. So we need time. Normally we cover such basins in courses like water politics in Middle East in 4 or 5 weeks. So the students were really, really very patient about in this morning. Those are really detailed and historically rich and politically interesting basins. And I would like to introduce Kevin Wheeler. He's the Senior Research Fellow at Environment Change Institute of the University of Oxford. And he's also involved with Utah State's Future of Colorado River project. His research focuses on shared water courses, transboundary water courses, and emphasizing multi-stakeholder negotiations and cooperative planning to manage environmental risks of multi-objective giant infrastructure like Grand Renaissance Dam. So we are very lucky to have him. The floor is yours, Kevin.
Okay. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I've got a lot of slides. It's hard to go through the history of the Nile in 20 minutes, but I'll do my best here. So the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. We'll talk about a description of the dam, some of the rationale, and then one of the papers we published on we call it the 3 eras. So the filling of the dam, potential new normal after the dam is filled, and then the risks of a multi-year drought. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the future development aspects of the Nile. So here's a good map from early days. I like this. This shows where the Nile is, and here is Egypt, and here is Ethiopia. Egypt has always long known that they're dependent upon Ethiopia for the waters. The their source of life, their source of the Nile, is synonymous with Ethiopia. But Egypt being 100% independent. When you fly over Egypt and you see only the line of water, the line of the water and the houses and the vegetation next to it, and all desert on both sides, you understand why Egyptians are so passionate about it. Their blood is the Nile. Their children are made of Nile water. Everything in Egypt comes from the Nile. So we're at the source of the Nile, Lake Victoria, and then Lake Tana up in Ethiopia. From Lake Victoria flows the Victoria or Albert Nile into the Sud wetlands, where about half of the water is evapotranspirated. And then flows on as the White Nile into the city of Khartoum in Sudan. Meanwhile, that merges with the Blue Nile coming from the highlands of Ethiopia. And the two rivers come together right in the middle of the city. And then flows northward as the main Nile into the 𝐻𝐈𝐿 Dam and all the way through Egypt up to the Mediterranean. Here's where the border of Ethiopia and Sudan is. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is being constructed just upstream of that border, about 20 kilometers. If you look side by side with the hydrology, so the thickness of the lines in this represents roughly the flows over the year. So about 30% of the water that flows into Egypt comes from the White Nile, about 13% from the 𝘱𝑗, about 57% from the Blue Nile, for a total of 100% flowing into Egypt. And the dam is constructed here on the Blue Nile. So about 53% of the overall water in the basin comes from upstream of the 𝘗𝑗 site. So it doesn't control all of the water that flows in Egypt, but it controls a very large portion of it for sure. So lots of discussion on the history. I'm just going to mention one thing. One bilateral agreement between Egypt and Sudan, signed in 1959, between Sudan and Egypt for the full utilization of the waters of the Nile. So when we refer to the allocations, 55.5 billion cubic meters for Egypt, 18.5 billion cubic meters for Sudan. This is only a bilateral treaty, so there's no other signatories involved in this. And it also specified the construction of the 𝐻𝐿 Dam. So what happens when upstream countries want to use the water? Well, they did actually include this. They said the countries will jointly consider and reach one unified view regarding the said claims, and they accepted that the amount would be deducted from equal shares of the two republics. So they did think about these things at the time. Some of the history: the 𝐻𝐿 Dam was constructed in 1902 on the first cataract of the Nile. The Sennar Dam and 𝘱𝑗𝑏𝑒𝑙 dams were constructed on the Blue and White Nile, respectively, during the colonial periods, and this would extend the flows going into Egypt to draw the irrigation season, as well as open up the irrigation within Sudan. 𝐻𝐿 Dam constructed in 1960s to 1970, relocated about 50,000 Sudanese, about the same amount from Egypt as well, but it also initiated the construction of the 𝘂𝐚𝐬𝑜𝘚 Dam on the 𝘱𝑗𝑏𝑒𝑪 River. The 𝘱𝑗𝑏𝑒𝑟𝑒 Dam in 1967, where a lot of the irrigation is also being controlled for Sudan. The largest dam in Sudan, the 𝘌𝑗𝑏𝑒𝑪 Dam in 2009, was constructed in a very dry area. About the same time, Ethiopia started constructing their dams, their larger dam. 2009, the 𝐂𝐚𝐬𝑜𝘚 Dam on a tributary. The Tana Bellis project, a hydropower project. More recently, the 𝐈𝐬𝐵𝑒𝑟𝑒. So, and then the 𝘗𝑗. So it's one of a long line of different dams that have been constructed on the Nile so far. The dam is located here in this corner. Pointer. So the total average annual flow is 49 billion cubic meters. Total storage of the dam is 74 billion cubic meters. The active storage, what can be used regularly, is 59 billion cubic meters. So that ratio to the active storage to the average annual flow is very critical. So 1.2 can capture more than 1 year's worth of flow in this large dam. So, quick lesson here. So if you have a small river coming into a large reservoir, that ratio is going to be greater than 1. If you have a large river going into a small reservoir, there's not much engineering control there, that ratio is less than 1. So if you look at all of the different dams across the Nile, the 𝘗𝑗 and the Aswan Dam, sometimes called the 𝐻𝐿 Dam, 1.2, 1.46. All the other dams are very, very small numbers in comparison, except for this kind of outlier, which is a bit of a strange one. It's very low flow. But even the largest dam in Sudan, 0.09. So these dams have significantly more control than all the others. So that's why these two are the major flows. The 𝘗𝑗 layout, so there's a main dam as well as a saddle dam. I'll have some blow-up pictures of these. So the main dam is a roller compacted concrete design, open spillway in the middle. You can see in the picture here. I'll talk a little bit more. The saddle dam is a very long structure, about 5.2 kilometers long, only about 50 meters high, but it allows the upper part of the reservoir to be filled. And the two dams together would constitute the entire structure. Why is Ethiopia building this thing? Well, energy generation. It actually can't be used significantly because it's at the lowest part of the river within Ethiopia. It's not going to be used for extraction of water within Ethiopia. But it will create a lot of hydropower potential. How much? Roughly doubling the amount of energy generation that Ethiopia is currently using right now. Generating right now. So about 15 terawatt hours per year, generated 5,150 megawatts, oversized in many ways, but at the same time, it will be an incredible step change for Ethiopia. So they also, of course, the big question is how quickly can they actually use this energy or sell it? So they do want to open up regional power trade. Already lines going to Sudan, Djibouti, and now constructed in Kenya. So they need that to be able to bring a lot of money back in after all the expenses on this. So it's framing and forthcoming risks. So the first era, the filling period, going from empty reservoir to a full reservoir, a new normal period. So after the reservoir is filled and the hydrology is sort of average conditions or wet conditions, then what might happen during a multi-year drought? So the filling period is going on right now. There's a limited window of opportunity for an agreement. There'd be a lot of incentive, a lot of motivation right now for the countries to come together to agree to something. They have not been able to do it yet. The incremental filling only agreement, a small agreement, has not been accepted by Egypt or Sudan. They want everything or nothing, or for everything. The reservoir is about currently half full. It's been filling for the last 3 years, and there still is not an agreement on how to do it. For a little bit of a comparison, the size of this reservoir is the size of Lake Powell and Lake Mead combined, and sitting just 20 kilometers upstream of an international border. So it is ginormous. So where are they at in filling currently? So some numbers here. To describe the dam, there's a cross-section of the dam. There's a dead zone at the bottom. There's an inactive zone they don't really want to use, an active zone that they would use regularly, including a flood zone up at the top. And once it gets to 49.3 billion cubic meters, they would consider it the reservoir full. But the actual full level is actually 74 billion cubic meters. And in between, they would operate annually each year, but always bring it back down to this 43.9. So 620 meters above sea level. So they have a plan on how to fill it, and they've been following this plan, sort of. The first year, they would fill it 4.9 billion cubic meters, be able to release water for generating turbines, low-head turbines, then add another 13.5 billion cubic meters in the second year, and then every year after that, basically 10 to 10.5 billion cubic meters they would capture. So the overall plan was sort of 5 years. They've made it extended to 7 years, but 5 years was sort of their objective. So how have they actually done? Since 3 years have passed now. Well, the first it was pretty close, about 3 billion cubic meters. The second year, during the middle of some of the crisis in Ethiopia, turned out they only filled about 4.5 billion cubic meters. Then last year, they didn't totally catch up to that, but about 14 billion cubic meters, adding about 26 meters of additional height onto the dam. So it was a pretty big construction year for them last year. So the current storage is about 21.5 billion cubic meters. And to fill up this last 25 meters, about the same height they raised last year, it would store another 27.8 billion cubic meters. Every meter at the top is going to contain a lot more water behind the reservoir. It's going to be filling much more, a much larger volume for the same elevation increase. Once we get to 49.3. So here's what a view of the dam looks like. It's 4 diversion outlets that are now closed to be used during the construction process. 2 bottom outlets that they have opened during the construction to try to dry out the dam. Early generation turbines, which have been constructed and operational right now. The rest of the turbines on both sides. And then what would happen, and this is called the low block spillway through the middle. And water is pouring through that middle section typically. And then as they build the dam up, the low block spillway is the last thing to come up. So basically it fills up like a bathtub, and the water pours over the top. As soon as the rainy season comes, it comes and pours over the top. And these outlets aren't big enough to be able to pass all the water during the wet season, so it has to pour over the spillway. That basically becomes the control. What are the downstream impacts? Well, first, talk about the benefits in Sudan, and we'll talk about some of the risks. So increased control of flows will increase Sudan's ability to use agriculture. And I often tell my Egyptian colleagues, it's not Ethiopia that's going to cause that there'll be a risk. It's how Sudan develops to use that water downstream. That's really a big challenge for Egypt in the future. It'll decrease the amount of sediment flowing into Sudan. They have to dredge their canals, to operate the reservoirs to manage all the sediment coming down from the Ethiopian highlands. That'll be decreased significantly. And it'll also help uplift the energy production within Sudan of their own reservoirs. What are some of the risks? Dam safety is the #1 concern for Sudan. They need knowledge of how the GERD is going to operate for their own reservoirs within Sudan. I'll give an example of this. So, and the reason for this is because their next reservoir is just downstream, the 𝘱𝘰𝘭𝘰𝘨 reservoir of the GERD. So the large GERD with about 59 billion cubic meters that they could operate easily. So 5.8 billion cubic meters is the next dam, just downstream of it. So you have a very large reservoir that's only 20 kilometers to the border, 115 kilometers between the two dams. Okay, so you have a large dam with 21.5, a small dam with 5.8. Very ominous. So Sudan must be very well prepared to store or pass these releases that come from the GERD. So when that reservoir gets, the elevation, the spillway gets raised, start releasing water through outlets, Sudan has to plan ahead and empty out some space in the reservoir. And then when the GERD gets to its full level, it starts spilling over the top. They have to be ready to be able to release or capture that water. Very difficult task if you don't have good information. So the 𝘱𝘰𝘭𝘰𝘨 operator, the 𝘱𝘰𝘭𝘰🐬 dam, has to know how much water is going to be released every day, exchange of real-time information. This is a safe engineering practice. So the flows going into Sudan in the last few years, this is the maximum minimum with the blue as the average daily flows going into Sudan. So that first year of filling, this is what happened. Suddenly there was a drop for about 10 days, and then a very wet season through there. So this is what Sudan had to deal with. The next year, they tried to manage it differently, but they didn't fill it up very much. There was a small construction, so it jumped up. So this is very difficult for Sudan to try to manage this with a lack of information. Dam safety, nobody should want this dam to fail. It would be catastrophic for Sudan if this dam were to fail. There's currently no definitive safety risks. However, there's not good clarity of information either. Many modeling studies have been done, dam break analyses, satellite-based observations. One study pointed out using satellites vertical displacement of the dam up to 90 millimeters, 380 millimeters in the saddle dam. But I'd say it's very difficult to use satellites for this kind of thing. It's not a substitute for ground truthing. And good construction, and it's a good construction company, it's an Italian company, they should be monitoring very closely if there's any settlement. But the burden of proof is on Ethiopia to provide assurance of safety, or it's an opportunity for Ethiopia to demonstrate that their dam is safe. Ethiopia wouldn't want this to fail. Certainly Sudan wouldn't want this to fail. And Sudan needs a flood warning system in place. Risk to Egypt, what's the key question? Will Egypt suffer water shortages during the filling or afterwards? Egypt is very well prepared for this dam. They've been working very hard to prepare for this. The impacts do depend significantly on how much water is available here. If it's a wet year, a dry year, an average year, it's very critical. So the High Aswan Dam, here's since the 1990s, here's the elevation of it, or the storage amounts. And we can see it's, first off, here's the full supply level. At the bottom here, that's the minimum operation level of the High Aswan Dam. And if it ever falls below these levels here, they start reducing their amount of releases down through Egypt by 5, 10, 15%. Every year they used to bring it down to this level to be able to capture enough, have enough space for the floodwaters to come in. So the first thing we can see is the Aswan Dam is at its absolute maximum full capacity for the last several years. It's even been that bottom has been ramping up too. They have a spillway off the back end of the reservoir called the 𝘱𝘱 Spillway, and they've even been building onto that obviously to be able to bring it up. So they're keeping it extremely full right now in preparation for the Ethiopian Dam. Ethiopian Dam, like I said, it's almost halfway full now. And it's still very, very full. The Egyptian dam is. So the current storage and the new in the GERD, the remaining storage to fill 27.8. If they were to capture that water right now, it would basically bring it down to its normal flood operation zone. So they've captured a lot of water. If the dam were constructed and finished right now in Ethiopia, they could fill it up very quickly. It would drop the Egyptian reservoir down very fast, though, which would obviously cause a lot of panic. So really quickly, on the back end of the reservoir, of the Egyptian reservoir here, there's the 𝐷𝘗𝐸. Water's been spilling off into the desert for several years now because it's been so full. So it's been filling up these lakes. We can see from 2019 to 2020, these lakes filled up with water. It's because the reservoir has been so full. This emergency spillway has been in use, again, in preparation for the Ethiopian dam. So what do? In my research, I look at different operational policies. How could the dam be filled up in different ways to try to keep the downstream dams safe? So I look at a lot of different stochastic hydrologies and different ways of doing things. So what I've done here, I just sort of did a little updated analysis. If Ethiopia were to fill up the dam very abruptly right now, all the way to the top, what would be the implications? So when I go from the sort of cloud of different options and then sort of do sort of statistical percentiles, yeah, it would drop the reservoir down, but it would not drop it down into some critical level where Egypt would have to emergency cut off water at this point. Could it go down that low? Absolutely. If it were a dry year, it could. It could be very critical. But again, the most likely scenario is it would drop the 𝐈𝐸𝐵𝐸 Dam down. Now we have to think, even though it might not force shortages on Egypt, what would be the perception of the press standing on the Egyptian dam, looking how fast this dam dropped down? The optics on this are incredibly important. Even if there's physically not a risk, the perception of risk is actually part that matters a lot. So critical things to consider. The 𝐈𝐸𝐵𝐸 Dam will play a critical role. The initial conditions of the 𝐈𝐸𝐵𝐸 Dam matters a lot. The hydrology matters a lot. If it's wet or average, probably no significant impact. If it's dry, potentially could be significant if there's a dry season at the same time during the filling. And the amount of water retained in the GERD does not translate directly to the amount of water that gets shorted by Egypt. That's very important. So if we go to this, so the minimal impact so far, difficult for Sudan to manage, low risks and major impacts. But the optics are very important. So this new normal era. So once the reservoir is full, all the water that comes into the GERD will be released minus about 1.5 billion cubic meters for evaporation. It's a non-consumptive use. It's not going to use much water. It'll decrease some of the evaporation of the high 𝐈𝐸𝐵𝐸 Dam, but it'll mainly pass through. So when you look at the GERD and the blue line there, and the 𝐈𝐸𝐵𝐸 Dam before and after, looking at the GERD, it really doesn't change things very much at all. It just changes the timing. We would see that under average hydrologic conditions, the inflows would about equal the outflows more or less on an annual basis. The 𝐈𝐸𝐵𝐸 Dam would operate a little bit lower. The inflows would be much more predictable, and the extremes would be buffered. But really, wouldn't change very much. So minimal coordination would actually be required after the reservoir is full. Good data exchange will still be very important, especially between Ethiopia and Sudan, and generally minimal risk to Egypt after the dam is full, during average conditions. The problem is the risk of becoming complacent. If the dam gets full, Ethiopia has much less of an incentive to come to an agreement. Egypt would sit with the possibility of a drought in the future. So again, the new normal, large jumps in energy, minimal losses would probably happen unless large agricultural diversions were to occur in Sudan specifically. But there's a substantial risk of no action if nothing happens. So what happens if there's a multi-year drought? What might we expect? Well, normally a reservoir would drop down, stay low for a while, and then refill. With the new dam, maybe it would drop down lower and refill. So if we first looked at if the 1980s drought, the worst in history for the region, in the recorded history, or in some modern recorded history, if that were to happen again now, the 𝐈𝐸𝐵𝐸 Dam would drop down very, very low, close to its minimum operation level. So you have this drought onset period, a drought recovery period. The 𝐈𝐸𝐵𝐸 Dam, right now, even without the GERD, would fall down through these management levels almost to the bottom if the 1980s drought were to occur again today. Why? Because it would actually be worse because Sudan is using much more water. And you'd have shortages in Egypt, primarily driven by their own policies. So about 8 billion cubic meters would be shorted. Remember, they have 55.5 billion cubic meters is how much they say they use. So it'd be a pretty significant loss of water for Egypt during that time, even without the GERD. But what would happen if the GERD were constructed? Well, one scenario is if they generated constant hydropower. So I'm just going to throw out one scenario here, and the GERD is full, and they're generating and they're releasing water during the drought times. Well, the first thing you would see is a change in what the 𝐻 Dam would do, and it would take that distribution of shortages and it would shift it later in time. So at the onset, the GERD would actually protect Egypt if it continued to make releases, if Ethiopia continued to generate hydropower during that time. If there was a policy to sell hydropower, somehow Ethiopia had to continue generating electricity, it would actually help Egypt downstream during the onset of the drought. However, during the exiting the drought, during the recovery period, would be very difficult because potentially both reservoirs would be very empty at the time. So you could add additional shortages to Egypt because they wouldn't recover as fast. Egypt would be in an extremely stressful position at this point, and they would have major concerns if Ethiopia were filling the dam up first. This would be a very difficult but preferred scenario by Egypt because they continue to release water. However, in this particular scenario, Ethiopia has brought their dam all the way down to the bottom. So Ethiopia would never agree to this either, because they're going to lose their whole ability to generate hydropower. So we're going to find something somewhere in between. Neither country would like the situation. It would be very dangerous for both countries. But the difficulty of trying to thread the needle in a challenging position. So unsuitable for Ethiopia. So again, recovery from the drought would be the biggest challenge. Both countries would want to recover their dams as soon as possible. It'd be a prioritization. Which order should the reservoirs be refilled first? What is a priority here? What needs are most critical? Is it drinking water? Is it reliable hydropower generation? Does agriculture come later? So these are very critical things that the countries have to agree with. So a multi-year drought. A drought occurring today would be worse than it was in the 1980s, just because more water is being used right now. It would be very difficult to manage if there were no coordination plan in place, and there would be a need for a very clear and binding agreement prior to a drought coming in. So what's under dispute is the right for future uses and development projects within Ethiopia. That's what's really holding up any kind of agreement. Countries more or less have sort of an understanding that the risk of the filling is very low now, but they can't agree on future uses. Now, all across the basin, there's massive demands to use more water. Here's the different sub-basins here, the main Nile, the 𝐤𝐴𝐬𝐫𝐵, the Blue Nile, the other area here. Each country's demand, so there's another 50.5 billion cubic meters that the countries want to use. There's obviously not that much water available. It's already all being used pretty much. There's no way. Ethiopia, however, if you look just upstream of the GERD in the Ethiopian highlands, you see they want to construct a couple more dams upstream, hydropower dams, and all of these smaller irrigation areas that they have interest in constructing are pretty small volumes. So they want a cascade of dams first off. But 0.06, 0.09, some of the other ones over here, 0.5 billion cubic meters. So relatively small but very dispersed irrigation areas upstream. But the very important point here is it may not be economically smart to build to expand irrigation upstream of hydropower dams, because those things are going to be in conflict. They're going to spend all that money to build these dams. Why do you take water out upstream and pass less water through the dams? Economically, that makes much more sense to leave the water in the streams, and for the reservoirs to generate hydropower. Those are non-consumptive uses. And I'm not advocating for new dams, but new dams increase the value of the water being passed downstream. So that's a very important point that we're looking at a lot right now. It's really the trade-off, and ironically, that benefit of having those dams may benefit Egypt the most. Summary messages. The window for an opportunity in the filling process is closing. It's not closed yet. They can still come to an agreement. I really hope they would take advantage of this opportunity. Egypt is currently very well prepared to manage this filling process. The filling will cause the 𝐈𝐽𝘆𝘆 Dam to decline significantly. It will cause to decline, but it's unlikely to force shortages upon Egypt. Maybe they might reduce voluntarily, but it won't hit the bottom for sure. Very unlikely. Sudan is the greatest risk, without any clear information of how the dams are operated or how much water is being released. There are technical solutions. We found technical solutions to be able to manage the filling process of the multi-year drought. But the parties really have to agree on either future development or agree to mutually exclude that from the negotiation process, which and if no agreement is reached during the filling, reaching this new normal state, it could be very uncomfortable because there are ideas on how droughts could be managed, but Ethiopia wouldn't be bound to those at all if the drought were to actually happen. And Egypt would be in a vulnerable position, and Sudan as well. So I'll say a management plan must be in place before a drought occurs. And I think that's all.
Any questions? Elie first and then David.
Thank you, Kevin. I was out for 2 minutes, and you might have referred to that, but in our class we referred in past years to threats by the Egyptian government to take military action against Ethiopia. In particular, I recall those issued by the former, I'm not sure whether he's deceased or not, by Mohammed Morsi, the prime minister representing the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, that he was about to send the planes. So can you relate to that? I mean, yeah. And one more comment. One of the speakers yesterday said, I think it was David, who said that most transboundary conflicts have been being resolved peacefully. So can you bridge the two situations?
Absolutely. This has been held up for a long time as one of the potential hotspots where maybe a war could break out. Most people don't think so. This really has brought the countries to talk about the situation, and we have nobody wants a military action on this. I mean, I think that it would be disastrous for the entire region if there were military action taken. The time during Mohammed Morsi, there was a very famous session of Egyptian politicians, and people were going around saying more and more rhetoric and suggesting notions of bombing the dam, and it was actually being live televised, which the people didn't understand at the time. And it got spread all over YouTube, and the Ethiopian media had a heyday with this. And basically, it looked very bad for the Egyptians at that point. But Mohammed Morsi, once they realized it was being live televised, he said, no, we're not going to do this. So from the highest level, there's certainly a lot of reality checks of how disastrous this can be. There are always elements within these countries that are extremes. And there's voices saying this and that. Realistically, it would be horrible for everybody for a foreign attack on this. It would be difficult to do. It's a large project. I would hate to think the ramifications geopolitically if Egypt were to take military action. I think the U.S. obviously plays a critical role in pressure.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. That was a great presentation, and I learned a lot. I've read some of your stuff, not all of this. I didn't realize how productive you are. Congratulations. But I've read some of your stuff, but this really put it more in perspective. Couple of questions that I was just unsure of, not knowing the region that well. If there's a drought in Ethiopia, does it necessarily mean that there's a drought in Egypt and vice versa? Is it sort of similar climate, or is there a scenario where there's more drought in one area or there is drought in one area? Okay, so right. So yeah, I know that rainfall in Egypt is like 3% of their actual consumption or something. It's negligible. So you're only worried about the drought in in Sudan and Egypt. I mean, in Sudan and Ethiopia, right? Are these sort of one climatological system, or are we looking at
That's a good question, because Sudan or Ethiopia and Sudan, Blue Nile is more or less one, but the rest of the Nile around Lake Victoria is very different. They operate but a lot of that water again gets lost in evapotranspiration. So those two don't necessarily line up. One can be in a drought, one can not be in a drought. Typically, that lower flow coming from the White Nile has been able to sustain sort of strong base flow coming through the long Nile. And the Blue Nile has a much larger spike going through. So if that gets harmed in any way, you still have very full conditions in Lake Victoria right now, but overtopping the lot. So I think that's very connected to the Indian Ocean dipole phenomenon. It's not one-to-one, but the vast majority of water does come from Ethiopian parts.
right? So you said that it was in one of their first graphs, it was like 57% or something comes from the Blue Nile, and I had heard that it was something like 80%. How do you?
Great question. And this is something that's incredibly misunderstood. When you hear about this is what happened so there's Ethiopia Highlands, or Ethiopia in general, has Ethiopia is not just the Blue Nile. Ethiopia also contributes to the Sobat over here, and also contributes to the Afar over here.
Okay.
So when you take all of the Ethiopian contribution, that's 85% probably of the total water. I mean, there's water coming in from the Sud that's not mineral, but a lot of this water comes all through the Sud. So that's why we put this number 85%. But the GERD related one is 57, 53%.
Okay. Okay. Thanks for that clarification. And one of the other questions, I mean, obviously, Sudan sort of changed its tune a little bit, that it was sort of against, and now it's sort of for, with hesitations and qualifications and whatnot. Is that primarily because of the benefits of flood control, or what caused Sudan to change its tune?
Well, so Sudan's always been very split because there's very strong benefits and risks as well. The biggest thing is it's going to flatten the hydrology. So the Blue Nile has huge spikes through it, so it makes it difficult for them to manage it. They have very small dams in Sudan. Once the GERD is built, it's going to flatten that hydrology. They can divert much more water. They can start double cropping very quickly. So there is a huge economic incentive for Sudan. Ethiopia considers it a freebie for Sudan, basically. When Ethiopia operates logically for hydropower, it means Sudan's going to benefit from this. So when Bashir, the president of Sudan, got behind the dam, then everybody said, okay, we agree with the dam. They even contributed machinery to help the construction, supposedly. But at the same time, it does pose risks, and the mercurial, mysterious nature of sort of inspections of the dam has raised a lot of flags within Sudan as well, specifically in terms of the dam safety issues. Again, there's no evidence of dam safety issues, but Sudan also recognizes that they need to know what's going on upstream. And if Ethiopia is not providing that information upstream, that's a risk for Sudan. And the lack of knowledge is a risk. So Sudan changes tune. Sudan's been very split on whether to support the dam or not support the dam. And it's been, they know they would benefit in the long run as long as the dam is built well and operated well. But they need assurance that that's actually going to happen. And tensions have been built up within Sudan. Tensions between Ethiopia and Sudan have increased about 𝐬𝐵𝑥 area, some of the conflict border zones. And so right now, now things are extremely difficult. But there's been more reconciliation between Sudan and Ethiopia prior to the horrible situation in Sudan. So that relationship. And of course, Egypt, they don't want this bilateral relationship between Ethiopia and Sudan. They want Sudan to stay in their corner, sort of pressuring Ethiopia for a big basin-wide agreement. But Sudan really needs that assurance every day that the dam will be operated well. So Sudan is very much caught in the middle. Optimum between.
Sorry, I think we need to move on. Was there another question? We can do one more. I'll take it.
Hi, I came late. Maybe you may have talked about this, but I know like the geography of that part of Sudan, Egypt, and Ethiopia is pretty arid, like arid land, and you talked about drought. But considering like climate change and the building of dams, is there also at some point a risk of flooding or something like that?
That's a great question. Sudan's biggest concern has been flooding, and one of the biggest benefits of the dam would be the reduction of flooding in Khartoum, where the two rivers come together here. Right in Khartoum, there's a small dam on the White Nile that tries to keep back the peak flooding until the White Nile to the Blue Nile floods, but they're constantly struggling to be able to maintain the river from flooding into 𝘠𝑚 and the cities. So that's foremost on their minds. And Khartoum does not have good infrastructure to deal with flooding, especially can't stop the Nile flooding. And they're building up their businesses and their roads around the city, but they're at constant risk of very high floods. The dam will probably help that. Will probably reduce the amount of flooding in Khartoum. But again, it has to be operated safely. One of the big things, like we found out in New Orleans, when you build a bunch of infrastructure, that not only reduces risk, but it also creates risk if it's not managed well, not protected well.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm going to bring up Aysegül again. Thank you very much.